smallest equality gap. When you took into account the mental health factors, one thing that strikes me about those countries in terms of suicidal ideation, suicide and self-harm, and those same countries with the small equality gap seem to have very high levels of those things. Is there any explanation you might put on that?
Yes, I'm sorry, I left out the slide that mentions that suicide is the only thing we found that goes the other way round. It's more common in more equal societies. I think the reason for that is partly that in a lot of some countries there is not a social gradient in suicide. I know in Britain we've only had a social gradient in suicide since the 1970s. The other reason is that I think there is a lot of truth in the cliche that violence either goes in against yourself or out against other people. It seems to me it's a matter of whether you blame other people or blame yourself for what goes wrong. In a very famous paper on Harlem in New York, Health in Harlem, which at most ages death rates were higher than in rural Bangladesh. Suicide was the only cause of death which was not more common in Harlem than the rest of the US. So suicide is not part of the pattern. Japan used to have very high suicide rates, and Sweden as well. The expectation you might have, it doesn't fit suicide. I think there are answers to those questions. Actually, Eastern Europe is very interesting because their health was as good as Western Europe until about the late 1960s, and then it suddenly stopped improving, and we went on improving. And so a great gap opens up between East and Western Europe, and if you look at the figures, you think, if we understood what went wrong around about 1970, we'd know why all those regimes fell at the end of the 80s. But I think the answer to the coerced issue, and very often people feel that the cost of greater equality is freedom. A lot of people only have a model of equality as something that is produced by state diktat and so on. And that's why I emphasize economic democracy. But in Japan, their greater equality, interestingly, their greater equality comes because they have smaller income differences before taxes and benefits. They don't depend so much on redistribution as, for instance, Sweden does. And we see similar contrasts among the American states. Some of the more equal ones are more equal because their earnings differences are smaller, and some because there's more redistribution. But the reason why Ron Daw, the great expert on Japan, says that Japanese incomes were more equal, and they, like Sweden, have been widening out recently, is that more directors were promoted from within Japanese companies, and so still have loyalties to other colleagues in the organization, instead of being a financial elite parachuted in to business. And British and American business is notorious for being run by a sort of financial elite who have no necessary loyalties to the company and so on. The other thing Ron Daw says is that, of course, there was share ownership between interlocking firms, between suppliers and consumers of what a company produced, but also he says that sometimes trade union leaders would move across and become directors in companies. And so, if you change the circumstances in which directors are operating by having more employee representatives or by having people promoted from within the company, it becomes harder to award yourself huge bonuses while laying off people elsewhere in the organization. And Ron Daw says that's exactly how things worked in Japan. Directors in the small recessions Japan used to have would take pay cuts to avoid laying people off, which you can only see as an ethical difference, which comes out of working in a different social environment. And that's why I emphasize almost any measure of greater employee democracy. And that's not coerced, it's doing it by extending democracy rather than by limiting it.
I'm Joanna Tulby. I'm the Labour Party spokesperson on the environment. And my question relates to actually the question that was asked by Professor McBurty earlier. A lot of campaign groups and political parties that have climate change high up on their agenda, they don't have the issue of equality high on their agenda. But for many of them, it's not even on their radar. And one of the things I picked up from reading your book was that if there was more focus on just reducing income inequality, that would make a huge stride in terms of tackling the issue of climate change. And I just wanted your comments on that point.
I think you're right, and that's why we did a chapter on environmental things, although the book is mainly about equality. We were invited to write a report for the London Sustainable Development Commission, which is an offshoot of the Greater London Authority. That should come out in another month or so, but we were making exactly that argument about it's not simply containing consumerism or reducing consumerism and the pressure to consume. It's also going with the increased social capital, the greater levels of trust, the greater involvement in community life, is a stronger sort of public spiritedness that seems to be part of equality. And so in the report we've done for London, we looked at recycling. I can't remember whether we put that in our book, but more equal countries appear to recycle more of their waste. We also found a survey of what business leaders in different countries, how important they thought it was that their governments should keep to international environmental agreements. And very clearly, there's a tendency for people to think that international environmental agreements are more important in the more equal countries. So I think you see that sense of public spirit is a different kind of attitude coming out, even looking at foreign aid as a proportion of GNP per capita, or the Global Peace Index. You know, it's not chance that it was Britain and the USA that more than any other country that went into Iraq. You grow up with a different idea of how people relate to each other, and the use of sticks and carrots and so on.